I think being Asian is recognizing my history, my culture, and having the motivation to learn about yourself.
I value the culture that the Asian community has. I think we're very tight knit. We're very hardworking individuals. Yeah, those are just a few words of how I see myself as an Asian American or American Asian.
Being in America, I think being Asian is a more larger encompassing identity too, the along with being Chinese myself. I think Asian American is a whole other identity that I carry.
You are from America and you are from, at least for me, Korea, and yet you belong to none. That for me is being Asian American.
I guess it does get a little complicated with me because I am biracial, so I'm half white and I'm half Asian. And my mom was like, yeah, you get the best of both worlds. Like, you get your American side and your Chinese side. And I was just like, that like sold me on it.
There's no such thing as being a bad Indian. Like, everyone has their own ways of celebrating their culture and their identity. I still like present as a South Asian. It is what it is.
I think for a lot of us, that kind of identity is hard to like grasp, I think, because all of us come from different backgrounds.
I think more so because I'm second gen in America. When people ask, what are you? It's not because they want to know that you're American. Like, they want to know, oh, like, you're Asian, you're Chinese. So I guess that's why I identify, when I think of myself, I think more of myself more as Asian rather than Asian American.
I actually asked my mom this like recently. I was like, what, like when people ask me this, like, what do I say? Am I Indian American? Am I American Asian? Like, what do I classify myself as? Like, just, I guess on further thought, what I came to was that I was born and raised in America. I'm an American citizen. And so I guess priority goes towards that I'm American first and then Asian. That's not to discount by any means like like how much I value the culture, etc. It's just, I guess I'm more familiar with the American customs, the American culture.
I think definitely I identify with being Asian American because American is also a whole other identity that like it's different people of different races experience different things with that identity. So I think for me, I feel most comfortable identifying with being Asian American.
Typically, most South Asians that I encountered while I was a child, they were all first generation. And I fall into a very weird middle ground sometimes. And that is because, so my parents grew up in America, but they hold a lot of traditional South Asian values close to heart. I always felt as if I didn't really have a place growing up because I wasn't white, but I also wasn't cultured enough for other South Asians, is what that felt like.
I don't think recognizing oneself as Asian American or Asian in certain situations is wrong because, there is some fluidity to it.
Before coming here, I always used to preface things with, yeah, but I'm a bad Indian. And I'm realizing now that that is such a problematic statement because there's no such thing as being bad at your own identity. Like, what does that even mean? But that is something that I've really had to unlearn. And so terms like whitewashed, I think, were thrown around a lot.
I think that maybe the reason why I identify more as Asian is because, so my town was pretty white. Like when I went to a summer camp like program that had a lot of Asians, and my Asian friends there, most of them spoke Chinese, and so they would be like, oh, like, you're so white, like, you're very whitewashed. And so I think that kind of rejection from other Asians gave me a lot of shame for not knowing how to speak Chinese.
Growing up, I went to a school that was predominantly white. I think I was like one of two Indian kids in the school. Everyone else was white. And so growing up early on, I've been exposed to an environment where I had to quickly grow comfortable being the outlier, I guess. I think it's made me appreciate the differences that I have and and you know how like the unique perspective I think I bring to communities that are maybe largely white, or you know, like any other culture really.
With a lot of like Asian, like racism against Asian, I think it's hard to recognize when it's happening because it's so subtle in America, and like because of like the whole like model minority thing, like I think a lot of people feel that it's harder to be racist against Asians, and the subtleties of that kind of blind you to like what's actually happening.
I think it's a lot more nuanced than racism against like Black people or other minority groups.
Like you know, during my first week of at Emory, when I was going and meeting friends, I feel like if I was white, I've actually thought about this a lot, but I felt like, what if I was white, you know, like what if I was a white kid and it was my first week at Emory, I had the same personality, you know, everything, like looks were the same, glasses, long, like tall, like lanky kid, but I was white. Like what difference would that make? And I honestly think like more people would have come up to me, and more people would have talked to me, and more people would have like been quicker to like welcome them into their social circles, rather than me trying to like open up first and like say, look, like I'm no different than you, it's just like I'm brown, like what else does that make?
When you're little, you kind of don't understand the whole concept of race, but I think I remember this so vividly. Like in elementary school, my first experience with race was playing on the playground when I was in like 3rd grade or something, and some kid was like all Asian, all Chinese people are scaredy cats, you can't do this. I never realized that I was different from other kids, and hearing that really like brought into focus of race. And for the longest time, I honestly thought like Asian was like a bad word because of the kids around me and like the associations that comes with it and stuff. And like kids saying that like I can't do this, or I'm this way because of my race. Even though my area had a lot of Asian people, I still remember like being on the bus and like being called like getting called a slur.
I guess I personally would identify as Asian American. One thing that did point to this tension, this was freshman year at Emory, and it was like the Mid-Autumn Festival, and I was like explaining it to this friend, and this guy who I like didn't know like overheard our conversation because we were just like in a common area, and he was like, what do you know about this? Like, you're not Asian. And I was like, yeah, I am. I'm half Chinese. And he was like, that doesn't count. And then he literally went to someone at the table over, like this like full Asian guy, and was like, is today the Mid-Autumn Festival? Like, this girl like thinks she knows she's talking about it and like says it is. And he was like, yeah, it is. Like, why are you asking me? And I just like felt like really invalidated in that moment.
You know, actually, so when I was in preschool, I was bullied. Like I remember being bullied by these 2 kids, and I don't remember like what they did, but I remember like every time I would see them, I'd get like my chills, you know, and I just feel so uncomfortable, and like I'd hate like seeing them at school every single day, just because I knew they were gonna like say something. And it was like these 2 white twins, and it's nothing against like white people by any means. It's just that I think there's a certain sense of ignorance to some people. They may just see that, oh, he's different, so it's easy to just like call him out for it, you know. Like
I sort of went through like a phase, and I think this is pretty common for anyone who does not identify as white, is where they wish they were like more white. Like maybe they wish their hair was like a little bit lighter, or they wish that they had a less strange sounding name. Those are just examples. Yeah, I definitely went through that. And I was also like born with lighter hair, and it was like getting darker as I got older. And I was like, wow, like this is so sad. Like I wish I kept my like my dad is blonde, so I was like, I wish I kept my like dirty blonde hair.
The most prominent moments where I felt very different and isolated was during lunch. That was like the prime time when I felt isolated and embarrassed for the food that I ate, embarrassed for the school lunch boxes that my mom made, which now I feel so bad for like feeling embarrassed about it because she put a lot of love into it.
I think the biggest thing at Emory, for me at least, like overly fetishized like stereotypes of Asian women, and I experienced so much of that from like white frat boys. They expected me to be like the submissive like Asian girl and stuff, and like they thought that they could just treat me like and like because like I wouldn't fight back or whatever.
I read this quote in class, and I just think this is like such a beautiful quote in terms of how to approach life while being aware of my Asian identity. And it's from Living with Music by Ralph Ellison. Those who know their native culture and love it unchauvinistically are never lost when encountering the unfamiliar. And I think that really spoke to me because I had many African American friends, and they told me about their racial experiences that they get. And with that, I really felt as though, you know what, they have their differences as well, and they must struggle a lot in terms of identity in the United States, just as I do. And so with that, I became more open to sharing who I am as well. I did experience, however, something in the beginning of COVID, when like we started quarantining. The Publix at Emory Commons here, I was just buying something, and I was at the cash register, and a woman dropped her, I guess, like packet of broccoli on the floor, and I picked it up for her. She put it to the side, and she was like, "I don't want something an Asian touched." And I think that was the first time I experienced such a very vivid and forward racist statement towards me. It was such a stark difference from like the subtle racism that I like kind of felt in my community around me.
Watching my dad go through the airport security line, there's always a bit of weird suspicion. I remember being like 10 or 11 years old, and the white man in front of my dad didn't have to take off his jacket, and a different TSA officer told my dad, like, no, you have to take yours off and put it in the bin. And my dad was like, why? But this man is going through wearing his jacket, like, why can't I wear my jacket? And at the time, I remember being kind of confused about it. Like, it's not a big deal, Dad, just like take off your jacket, move on. But and he didn't make a scene about it. These things happen with Asian Americans, and we just move on. And it really shouldn't be just a thing that we accept and we move on. Like, oh, if you present with a darker skin color, you're just gonna have to take off your jacket. That doesn't make sense.
There is a like Asian burden, I guess, of like, oh, you don't want to make a big splash, especially like I think immigrant communities in general, like regardless of race, are kind of like when they're an immigrant, they don't want to make a big deal out of things. They want to show that they like belong here or like prove their worth.
I cope by I go back to my culture, even if it was the reason why I experienced the racism, instead of completely ignoring it and neglecting it and blaming it as the fault of racism. I think really grabbing onto it again and recognizing this is who I am, this is my culture. If you learn to love it unchauvinistically, like Ralph Ellison said, you can really recognize that you are not to blame when you become the victim of racism.
So I'm from Oxford, the Oxford campus, and there was this new club being created called like Oxford Men of Color, Oxmoc, and like my friend who was Asian like wanted to join, and they were like, we don't think you count as being like of color, and he was like, what? I'm not white.
The myth of the model minority is like harmful. Like academics was a pretty big struggle of mine, so I really had to work hard to get to where I was at. So, but because of the model minority myth, I felt that my achievements were basically overlooked. People didn't acknowledge like how hard I worked, and basically just brushed off what I accomplished as just like, oh, she's Asian.
With the model minority myth, it's like you're falsely placing a ethnicity on a pedestal at the expense of other ethnicities and races. But when it comes a time to actually support these ethnicities that you're placing on a pedestal, you don't actually support them. And this is very apparent in terms of, the COVID crisis last year, or that's still going on.
When the shooting happened a few weeks ago, I remember feeling so shocked. Violence against Asians was never something that like severe to have noticed. And I think that comes from like Trump coming into office too, because that fostered so much xenophobia against China in particular.
When COVID first became a problem in the US, or it looked like it was going to be a threat for the US, the president of the United States of America stood there and said, this is the China virus.
I look at like Obama's presidency, and I don't remember seeing as much as polarization or like any sort of like obviously discrimination was there still, like it was still a big problem. But when Donald Trump came in, this guy doesn't know anything about like culture or like, like he's lived in the spotlight his entire life. Like he's gotten everything he wants. He's like a rich kid, grew up with like wealth and money. Like I think it was very easy for him to like polarize the nation. And I think now we're just seeing the repercussions of that, which is like, there's a skyrocketing of anti-Asian hate crimes, for example, or like, the recent, not recent, but like George Floyd's murder. And like, I mean, thank God Derek Chauvin was like convicted today, like it's good. Like that's a step in the right direction, I guess, but like still there's a lot of work to do. And I just think like the problems we're seeing now is just can be attributed to like the past president, the past presidency.
I know that like these sentiments have existed before, even though a lot of my non-Asian identifying friends like kind of didn't. So I knew like this stuff was happening before. So I've been trying to research to see if there really is an increase in rates, or if they just weren't as like reported by media before, or weren't even like reported to police before at the same rates, because I think that also plays a part. But I do think that the pandemic has caused an increase. They, instead of calling it like the coronavirus pandemic, calling it and associating it with China and Wuhan in particular was definitely not helpful. And that's actually one of like the cities that I still have like very close family in.
It's so sad to see that it just takes one individual to like ignite the fire that was like hidden in so many people. Like it's quite scary to an extent, because it makes you question how many people truly feel that way.
And I think that people are looking for someone to blame. And instead of blaming the president for the things that he's done or anyone else who's higher up, people find it easier to prey on people that they see as less than.
It makes your guard go up. First of all, you're like, wow, like maybe I don't feel as safe as I thought I was.
With the rise in hate crimes, I don't know if it's always been this violent. I feel like, I guess during the pandemic, it's become more violent. Like when I first came home in March, when the pandemic first started, March 2020, I did feel self-conscious running in my neighborhood. I was like, oh, I feel like people are looking at me, and I'm worried that people think that I'm gonna give them COVID. Like I'm gonna make sure that I wear my mask when I run so that people don't have that thought.
So when the whole violence against Asians thing first started, my mom was like watching the news and how they were reporting that like there were attacks against like elderly Asian people. And my mom got super worried about that. So I remember her like taking off like the Lucky Charm that we have in our car, so that we wouldn't get vandalized. And she would always be telling me to like keep your head down, don't be too loud, don't stand out. And when I first heard that, I thought that she was being a little dramatic and over the top. When I heard about the shooting, because it was so close to where we are in Atlanta, like it felt so real and it was so close to us. And so when I heard about it, I also took off like my Lucky Charm that I have in my car.
My family just told me to stay safe. I also was so scared for my family. Adding on to the anti-Asian sentiments from the pandemic, I told my parents like don't go anywhere today.
after the like tragic shooting in Atlanta, like my parents called me and they were like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm okay." But we basically didn't talk about it past that, which I thought was kind of surprising. I think they're both just sad, and I think that for them, and this is why I didn't push it, is for them, like they just need some more time to process.
And I remember like reading a GoFundMe page about there was like a boy and his brother, and his mom was the one who was killed in the shooting. He was like, I think he was like 20 or 21, and he had a younger brother, and he put out this GoFundMe that was basically saying, look, I wish I had time to like feel sad about my mother's death, but like she was a single mother, she was caring for us, and now I don't have any parent in my life, and I have to figure out, first of all, how we're gonna gain money to survive. Secondly, I have a younger brother to take care of. That story just resonated with me because it's like, you know, I'm living in this house, you know, I have both my parents here, but like what if in an instant, you know, like my mom and dad aren't here and I have a younger brother to take care of, and I you know, like I think it's very personal in that way, in the sense that I understood it a lot more, and I understood like the gravity of the situation.
Well, my mom is like a tiny little Asian woman. And so she was telling me like, maybe I should start like carrying pepper spray with me, like if I go into the city, like, do you think that's a good idea? And I was like, honestly, I think it is a good idea, because it's unfortunate that you even have to carry pepper spray, but like the reality of it is that if someone does like attack you, I would rather you have it and not use it than not have it and like and need it in a situation. So I was like, yeah, I think you should.
I think that my parents, I was actually surprised after the Atlanta shooting. They didn't react as strongly as I thought they would, because my parents, like especially my dad, is very protective, and like normally they would be like sending articles and stuff. Like in the past they've sent articles about like, oh, like this Asian hate crime here and like all this stuff. And like actually, so I think the same day or the day after, there was, I think in San Francisco, that Asian like elderly lady who beat up her attacker. So that was my cousin's aunt. This woman was beat up. Like at the moral of the story, she was traumatized, and like, but we're like happy that she fought back. But like, is this our standard now? Maybe because it's closer to home, they don't talk about it as much. It was more of my dad just being like, do you have your pepper spray? Like I'll ship you a new one, which he ended up doing.
What I would like to see is more support from like non-Asian counterparts to really just accept it. I think that we have talked about racism in other communities, which is extremely important as well. I'm not denying that, but I think that we also should talk about, and we're starting to see some of it, which is really nice to see. It's just the reason why we're suddenly talking about anti-Asian violence is because these traumatic events have happened. So in order to prevent that, I mean, even yesterday, there's like a FedEx shooting with, you know, a bunch of Sikh people who, you know, it's ridiculous. Like, it sucks that we are getting to this place where traumatic events are forcing us to have these conversations. It's good that we're having the conversations, but why? I mean, even with George Floyd's death, why did these traumatic events have to happen for us to be having this conversation?
You know, I feel like as much as like, you know, me as like an Asian male tries to empathize with like the Black community when George Floyd was murdered, I think there's still a certain sense of alienation, like just because I'm not Black, you know, I can't really understand what they feel. Even though I'm, you know, like even though I'm in full support of that movement, there's still like a barrier to my understanding of what it means to be a Black male in America. Whereas in this case, you know, it's directly targeting your people in the sense that, you know, I totally understand what it means like to grow up in the United States as an Asian American.
The fact that all of a sudden people were paying attention to it, that was a very complex emotion for me to work through, because I was like, in my mind, when I went to sleep that night, I was like, oh, it's just another one of these. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, people are actually paying attention. And it's like, is that a good thing that people are paying attention? But also it took people dying for that to happen.
The most prominent concern I have now is whether these events of, Asian racism, one, are going to be identified as racially driven. And the second concern that I have is, whether these acts of violence, if they were not labeled as racially driven, will be kind of excused with another, stereotype, such as, the spa shooting of, it was like a sexual desire for this man, and so it perpetuates the stereotype of sexualization.
All of these shootings are like, there are white men behind them, and when there's a white man behind them, the discrepancy is like, I just cannot and will not get over the fact that the police chief just said he was having a bad day. I mean, someone with my same complexion could have gone out there and done the same thing and immediately would have been labeled as someone who committed hate crime, as it should be. That's how the system should work, but it doesn't.
After a certain point, you just get so tired of hearing the same news. Oh, a hate crime against this minority group, a hate crime against this minority group. Like it's just tiring, and like you just question, like, when is it gonna, like, when do people need to learn?
As Asian Americans, when we're telling you something is offensive or something isn't right, you just need to listen. And that is something that can be done like in an everyday form of conversation. When I'm telling you this isn't okay, you should be listening. And
it shouldn't be hard for a different ethnicity to practice appreciation of a culture rather than appropriation.
Basically, the true work needs to be done again, like on the ground with education, like
diversity of education, maybe, or diversity of like literature at a young age would actually help.
Like, I love Emory, I'm obsessed with Emory, but I do feel like I am a little bit in a bubble. I do think probably the best way is just to get out of your comfort zone and interact with people that you don't normally interact with.
The most important thing is simply education, really exposing not just Asian history, but also African history, Latin history, Latin American history. The public education system is lacking in that department.
And I think all minorities should, we have this shared sense of discrimination, like being in this country and stuff. So I think having a coalition would be absolutely wonderful, because we're all kind of suffering in this country, might as well band together to fight back against it instead of like infighting.
I think that the best thing that we can do as like minority groups is listen to each other.
Solidarity among other minorities is so important. Even if it's as small as Asian groups posting like "We stand with Black lives" or vice versa, I feel like is promising because it shows that they're willing to have that conversation.
There's so much ignorance, and like not a lot of people are willing to, number one, overlook it, and secondly, just learn and take the time to like ask someone, hey, tell me more about your culture. I'm super interested in it.
A lot of people don't understand the racism against Asians because like the model minority myth plays a lot into it. Like, oh, it's not that bad for Asians, so like, why should we care?
It shouldn't take tragedies for us to respect different cultures.
I want you to know where you are, who you are, because just as much as Asian culture for me is a foundation, I want to make sure that you also know that for yourself. I want you to be sure of that so that when you encounter me as a difference, you don't feel lost and unfamiliar and fearful.
I am Chinese American, and I am proud of that. I'm different than other people, but I love that difference, and I gladly embraced my cultural identity as being both Chinese and American.
The main theme of my family's immigration story, or my parents' immigration story, is opportunity.
I think most Asian American students, I guess, have heard, like hear this story all the time with like their parents have come to the United States with like 2 suitcases and like a crock pot.
Oftentimes I don't feel like our culture is like incorporated correctly into American culture. Not that there is a correct way to do that, but it is not appreciated in the same way. It's not seen as cool, and it's something that is cool to all of us.
I think it's extremely cliche and very basic knowledge, but you know, it has to be said. Be open to hearing out like what different cultures have to offer.
There is so much further for us to go in terms of just doing the bare minimum and respecting Asian culture.
Understand that even though a lot of like these minority groups may come off as okay and like, look, like I love my, you know, I love the way I am. Deep inside, people can be hurting just because of the way they've been treated by other people.
Try to start these dialogues.
Learning from other people's experiences and actively thinking about ways that we can be anti-racist.
Ask your friend, like, oh, like, do you want to talk about, like, I have some questions and I was wondering if you would be willing to talk about your experiences.
No one has the same experience. Each experience is unique, and to just continue to check in on those close to you, because I am getting fatigued. Just please check in on your friends.